Poor boy saves millionaire and 142 lives by piloting a plane and receives a gift from the president. The bucket water was icy, but it was the only thing coming out of the faucet for weeks. Mateus dipped his face in it and tried to wake up, 13 years old, and life already weighed on him like an airplane on his shoulders. While the city still slept, he swept the floor of the small house with peeling walls. Marinalva, his mother, had been washing clothes since 4 in the morning. Her hands no longer felt the cold or the soap, only exhaustion. On the table, a crumpled envelope. Inside, 2 plane tickets, round trip to Salvador. It was everything she had managed to save in 6 years of scrimping. Most people thought it was madness. Poor people don't fly, they said. Poor people should be grateful for an empty bus seat. But Marinalva didn't care, because this wasn't just any gift. It was her son's biggest dream, to see the sky from the inside, not from the rooftop. On the way to the airport, they took 3 buses. They heard snide remarks. A security guard asked to check if they were in the right place. The receptionist spoke too loudly, as if they didn't understand Portuguese. But nothing could take away the sparkle in Mateus's eyes. Every step into the terminal was like crossing an invisible border, where everyone seemed to know where to go, except him. While others stared at their phones, he looked at the ceiling, the floor, the glass, the planes, as if he was absorbing it all, as if he was entering a temple. At boarding, the contrast was striking. Starched shirts, brand-name backpacks, expensive suitcases, and there, a boy with worn-out sneakers, faded jeans, and shining eyes. When he sat in seat 17A, near the wing, his body trembled, not from fear, from pure admiration. Almost no one looked out the window, but he couldn't take his eyes off the engine, and that's when he saw it. A side panel, some kind of inspection cover, seemed loose, like it hadn't been properly fastened, small but visible. Mateus frowned. That didn't look right. He turned to the man beside him, a guy in a sharp suit with an expensive watch. He tried to explain, spoke quietly, politely, pointing outside. The man glanced, gave a quick look, and answered with a crooked smile. "What are you? A YouTube mechanic?" He laughed to himself, adjusted his headphones, and went back to his phone. Mateus shrank back, unsure what to do. Leandro Albuquerque, that was the name on his badge. Owner of an air logistics company, used to giving orders and ignoring. Mateus swallowed hard. He thought about calling a flight attendant, but the doors were already closing. His mother squeezed his hand and smiled, unaware. He took a deep breath, tried to convince himself it was just paranoia. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe it was normal. But deep down, something weighed on his chest. A strange silence, as if the plane had a secret and only he had noticed. Flight 218 took off, and with it, the premonition that wouldn't leave. The 30 minutes after takeoff, the sky looked calm. Blue, clear, with clouds scattered like cotton thrown in the wind. Mateus still couldn't take his eyes off the left wing. The loose panel was still there. Maybe it was just cosmetic, maybe not. He tried to relax. Looked at the commands on the screen of the seat in front. Recognized the patterns, remembered the simulators, the videos, the old manuals he had read cover to cover. But knowing too much is sometimes a curse. Suddenly came the sound. A dry, metallic, deep bang, as if something had broken inside the sky. The plane shook, hard. A vibration spread through the cabin. The left engine spewed smoke. A burst of fire could be seen from the windows. Screams. Panic. The oxygen masks dropped like ghosts. The floor trembled. A baby cried loudly. A woman fainted. A man began praying out loud. Mateus froze. What he feared was happening. He looked at his mother. Marinalva tried to stay calm, but her hand trembled. The PA system failed, then came back. The flight attendant's voice said they were in severe turbulence, but this wasn't turbulence. This was a failure. One of the engines was compromised, and from the vibration, he knew they wouldn't last long in the air. In the cockpit, the pilots were trying to control the situation. but they didn't know what caused the failure. One was injured. A crackling on the radio indicated incomplete Mayday calls. Information wasn't matching, communication was failing, and the tension was rising like smoke in a closed compartment. Mateus looked around. People were trapped between fear and ignorance. No one there understood, but he did. He understood too well. His heart raced. His head told him to stay quiet. But something stronger spoke louder. If he did nothing, the plane could go down. He got up from his seat, stumbled down the aisle, tried talking to a flight attendant. She told him to sit, said it was dangerous to stand. He insisted, "I need to get into the cockpit. I know what's happening." She almost laughed, said he was just a kid. That's when a firm voice came from behind. Listen to what he's saying. It was Marinalva, standing, eyes full of tears, but with the stance of someone who refused to be ignored. "My son has spent his whole life studying airplanes, studying with whatever he had. When everyone said he was wasting time, he was learning. If no one does anything, we're all going to die." Silence. The flight attendant hesitated. Mateus, sweating, stared at the closed cockpit door. It was there in that narrow aisle between economy class and the door of hope that a poor boy was taken seriously for the first time. The door opened. The cockpit smelled of sweat, burned rubber, and urgency. The captain was unconscious, a cut on his forehead. The co-pilot, pale, tried to control the plane, but his hands shook too much. Mateus stepped in. Small, awkward, with the thin body of someone who never had luxury, but with the sharp eyes of someone who knew exactly where he was. The flight attendant announced, "This is the boy." The co-pilot turned his head, took 2 seconds to realize it was serious. Mateus didn't ask for permission. He looked at the instruments, altitude, speed, torque, RPM. He scanned for the most critical data and calmly began to speak. "Left engine in total failure, asymmetric torque. We're losing lift. If you keep this flap level, it's going to stall." The co-pilot didn't reply. He just took his hand off the control stick. He was in shock. Mateus sat down. His fingers didn't shake. He adjusted the trim, corrected the bank, manually shut down the left engine to avoid more damage. The vibration eased a little. Outside, the sky seemed indifferent. Inside, a silence of disbelief. In the passenger area, the crew exchanged looks, not knowing what to say. What could be seen through the cockpit crack was unthinkable. A 13-year-old boy flying an Airbus. That's when Leandro appeared. Wrinkled suit, sweaty face, wide eyes. He came in ready to take control of the situation, but stopped mid-sentence. He saw Mateus, and he saw the stabilized controls. Silence. The businessman looked at the instruments, then at the co-pilot, and finally, at the boy. "What are you doing?" Mateus didn't even look at him. He just replied, "Trying to keep everyone alive." Leandro stepped back, speechless. For the first time, he wasn't in control. A quick flash, like a memory breaking in. Mateus at the community center, using broken headphones, flying an outdated simulator, correcting the landing gear with a frozen mouse. He wrote everything down in old notebooks, covered in newspaper, studied the commands in English, translating letter by letter. That's where he trained. That's where he learned to fly. Back in the real cockpit, the co-pilot took a deep breath. "What do you suggest, kid?" Mateus answered like a veteran. "Plot an alternate route. Check remaining fuel. See if there's a nearby runway. We're going to need external help, but first, stabilize." The co-pilot nodded. Leandro left without another word, but inside, something in him was starting to crumble. The certainty that power came from money was shaking. Outside, the plane kept flying, wounded, but in the air. And inside, the one keeping it alive, was a boy no one wanted to listen to. The vibration ceased, but the peace was an illusion. The plane was unstable, flying with only one engine. And the forecast worsened by the minute. On the radar, a storm was forming like a black wall on the horizon. lightning, severe turbulence, and no flight plan had accounted for that. In the cockpit, the situation was critical. Fuel was at the limit. The range had dropped drastically since the failure. They needed to decide, keep flying and risk it, or attempt an emergency landing. The co-pilot suggested looking for an open field, but Mateus knew what that meant. Without a proper runway, the chance of the aircraft flipping over was enormous, and then no one would survive. He remembered a place, a rural airstrip, barely used. Small, but enough. A hard landing, but possible. And it was on private land about 50 miles away. Exact location, property of Leandro Albuquerque. The businessman hesitated when he heard that. That strip doesn't take anything bigger than a single-engine plane. And with this weather, Mateus interrupted. He had already done the math in his head. If we fly low over the lake that's 10 miles from the strip, we can use ground effect. We gain lift, save fuel. We'll make it there. The co-pilot frowned. He knew the maneuver. It was dangerous, required extreme control, and no one had ever tried it in an aircraft this size. Have you ever done this before? He asked, skeptical. Mateus took a deep breath. No, but I studied those who did, and I know how it works. For the first time, he hesitated, looked outside. The storm was closing in. His heart raced, sweat rolled down his neck. At that moment, he wasn't the boy from the simulators anymore. He was a real kid, afraid of making a mistake. He knew that if he failed, death would come for everyone, including his mother sitting just a few feet away. For a moment, he thought of giving up, just for a moment, because then he remembered a lifetime of being called a dreamer. He remembered the times he studied by candlelight, the nights he went to bed hungry to buy a used aviation magazine. He remembered his mother's look when they boarded the plane. And there, in the middle of chaos, something inside him steadied again. If we try the open field, everyone dies. If we try the lake, maybe we live. I'd rather try. Silence. Leandro approached slowly. For the first time, there was no sarcasm, no authority, no ego. Just a simple question. And what do you need me to do? Mateus looked at him, without fear. Trust. The sky darkened quickly, as if time itself was in a rush to test the boy. The storm roared on the horizon. The plane, now flying low, cut through the air with effort, shaking like a kite fighting not to fall. The cockpit lights flickered, the radio failed, but the lake was in sight. Mateus fixed his eyes on the point where the water began. He knew if he missed the angle, the plane would touch the surface and explode. But if he flew just inches above, the ground effect would create extra lift, the invisible push they needed. The co-pilot just watched. He was no longer the instructor. He was a passenger. Marinalva closed her eyes, whispered a prayer without sound. Her lips moved, but fear was stronger than words. The plane descended further. The radar beeped non-stop. The wings scraped the wind like a dull blade. They flew over the lake, and for a second, it felt like they were floating. The maneuver worked, lift increased, altitude stabilized, and ahead, the runway appeared. Small, uneven, but there. A straight line between sky and ground. But the problem wasn't over yet. The landing gear wouldn't respond, nor the flaps, nor the brakes. It was like trying to stop a truck on a soapy downhill road. Mateus didn't hesitate. He made a decision. Only someone who had studied accidents and failures would have the courage to apply a controlled spin, a kind of aerial skid. He would use the plane's own rotation to dissipate the energy of the landing, throwing the fuselage's weight sideways onto the ground without flipping. No one understood, but he knew what he was doing. "Hold on tight," he said, not shouting, just firm. The aircraft hit the ground. No landing gear, metal against dirt. The sound was deafening. Mateus pulled the side control. The plane began to spin, once, twice, 3 times, dragging like a wounded beast. Inches before hitting the hangar, he forced the emergency hydraulic brake. The plane stopped. Silence. total. For 2 seconds, no one breathed. Then the screams, people crying, people laughing, people in shock, flight attendants hugging, children calling for their parents, everyone alive, everyone. Mateusz collapsed backward, his body gave out, he fainted right there, exhausted. Empty. As the aircraft gave way, cracks spreading along the fuselage, the boy who saved 147 people was carried in the arms of 2 firefighters. He didn't hear the applause. Didn't see his mother crying on her knees, didn't see Leandro, silent, hand over his heart. But in that moment, everyone knew that boy saved an entire plane, white light, smell of ether, voices in the background mixed with the distant sound of a television. Mateusz slowly opened his eyes. He was lying down, tubes beside him, a monitor beeping. His body felt light, almost floating. He didn't know if he was still on the plane. For a second, he thought he had died, but then he saw his mother's face. Marinalva was crying silently, sitting in a plastic chair by the bed, sunken eyes, calloused hands, holding a cup of water. "You're alive, my son." He tried to smile, but he was weak, very weak. The doctor came in shortly after, spoke calmly but directly. Mild anemia, signs of slight malnutrition, low blood pressure, nothing serious. Nothing that food, rest and care wouldn't solve. Nothing if he hadn't just saved 147 people on a falling airplane. Outside, the hospital was surrounded by reporters. The news was already spreading across the entire country. 13-year-old boy takes control of aircraft and prevents tragedy. Images from the cockpit had leaked. Experts commented. Veteran pilots spoke of a miracle. Social media exploded with videos of the mother praying, the crew crying, and of a boy fainting at the end of the runway, treated as a hero. But Mateusz wasn't watching any of it. He was only thinking one thing. He was ashamed. Ashamed of his poorly cared-for teeth, his torn clothes, his stomach that growled from hunger. A whole childhood of being invisible. And now, there were too many eyes on him. That's when the door opened. Leandro Albuquerque walked in. No bodyguards, no suit, no watch. Just him, a man broken inside and rebuilt by a landing that shouldn't have happened. He stopped in front of the bed, red eyes. It took him a while to speak. "Happy birthday, Mateusz." The boy's eyes widened. "Today?" Leandro nodded. He pulled a small package from his pocket, a simple chocolate bar. It was what he managed to buy on the way, after leaving the hospital, where he himself had also been examined. "I'll never forget this date for the rest of my life." Silence. Then Leandro knelt. No ceremony, no rehearsal. "I judged you, I ignored you, and you saved me." He swallowed hard. "I want to ask your forgiveness, and I want to tell you that my life changes today. From now on, I'll use everything I have to give wings to other Mateuszes, so no one else has to depend on luck." Mateusz didn't answer. He just let a tear fall. For the first time since the beginning of it all, he cried. There, he wasn't the hero of the plane. He was just a boy. A boy finally seen. The following days were a whirlwind. Tributes, news reports, phone calls from authorities. Veteran pilots visited the hospital. One of them cried when he hugged Mateusz, said that in 40 years of aviation, he had never seen anything like it. The landing video spread everywhere. People all over Brazil said the same thing. This boy needs to have a future. And the future began right there. Mateusz received a full scholarship at the best aviation school in the country, got a brand new uniform, complete study materials, classes in state-of-the-art simulators with instructors who now asked him for advice. But none of it changed him. He remained shy, humble. When asked how he had done all that, he only replied, "It wasn't me, God guided me." Marinalva became a symbol of strength. She began receiving help, security, medical support. She no longer washed clothes for others. Now she washed her own clothes with pride, knowing that the world was finally recognizing the value she had always seen in her son. Leandro Albuquerque changed as well. He sold part of his company, reduced his own salary, and founded a social project with a simple but powerful name, Wings of the Future. Goal: to reveal invisible talents in poor neighborhoods, to train, support, and empower. Because he understood what many wealthy people still haven't. Brazil is full of Matiases. They just need to be seen. The first class included 15 children, almost all from forgotten neighborhoods, almost all once dismissed, except by Matias, who was now a reference, a mentor, and a friend. On the day of his first flight as an official student, Matias put on his uniform, laced up his new sneakers, and looked out the boarding room window. The sky was clear. Marinalva was there, proud. With her hands over her heart, Leandro was there too, silent, with tearful eyes. The instructor called him. Matias climbed the steps to the small plane, entered the cockpit, touched the controls, took a deep breath, then looked out the window, and he saw the same sky as before, but now it was his. Outside, Marinalva waved. The plane began to taxi. If it were a movie, the camera would pull back. But here, there was only narration and a reverent silence. The final phrase came like a signature. Talent doesn't have a zip code, but it has hunger and courage. Now that you've seen what a boy was capable of, tell me, what if the next Matias is you, or your son, or someone invisible from your neighborhood? If this story touched you, share it. Someone needs to hear it today.